Maybe Fiona would have been better off if I were some sort of Prince Charming. Shrek.
Fiona knows you'd do anything for her.
Well, it's not like I wouldn't change if I could. I just wish I could make her happy. Hold the phone. Happiness. A teardrop away.
Welcome to the Graveyard Slot, where we talk about movies past their prime time.
Here, we revisit old favorites with a fresh perspective to see if they deserve more credit or if they should stay buried. I'm Sohini.
And I'm Sarah. Before we get started, we want to encourage whoever might be listening to visit eyesonsudan.net, which is run by a group of Sudanese volunteers.
It features a selection of vetted fundraisers run by grassroots organizations across the world and on the ground, providing aid in the form of health services, shelter, food, and more.
We encourage you to donate and contribute to the Keep Eyes on Sudan movement to help the Sudanese people. Today, we're talking about Shrek 2. In this sequel, Shrek and Fiona are happily married, at least so far. When an invitation to Fiona's parents' kingdom comes, the newlyweds will have to face their first of many marital hardships: in-laws. This movie came out in 2004 and directed and written by Andrew Adamson, who also did the first Shrek movie, but is a new writer for this one. So the writers for the previous movie was replaced by Adamson.
Much like its predecessor, Shrek 2 has solidified its place as a cultural cornerstone. It even has an incredibly high rating of 89% on Rotten Tomatoes, a factor that would usually mean it doesn't quite fit the profile for the kinds of movies we discuss on this podcast. However, critics' reviews reveal an interesting and perhaps incorrect predominant perception that the movie's concept is growing stale and that its merits lie mainly in its humor, while falling short on things like originality, character development, and plot. So in this episode, we want to investigate whether there's more under the surface and if, like the first movie, Shrek 2 has layers.
We're rating this one from 1 onion to 5 onions. I hadn't seen Shrek 2 before this.
I'm so glad that this podcast could introduce you to it.
Yeah. But yeah, I really enjoyed it. And I found a review by Washington Post that reflects my admiration of this movie.
For once.
Yeah. It reads, Shrek 2 is all about fantasy, but its characters are rousingly, affectingly real. Not to mention real funny. But I think it kind of hits the nail on the head. The characters are definitely the strong point of this movie.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And I think that goes for movies that have fantastical elements or are really out there. You need really strong characters and you need human elements to ground it. So I think, yeah, Shrek 2 definitely does a good job of that. Which is why I was so confused actually that so many of the reviews that I read seem to pinpoint the humor as its strength. And I mean, it is a very funny movie, but I do think it has merit beyond the humor as well. A lot of the reviews that I read talked about how it's not as original as the first movie and how it's not really adding anything to the story that we established in the first movie. And I think one review that captures this sentiment is from AV Club, and it says, the lovable characters remain, but they never do much of interest in a sequel that's safely above average but superfluous. And I don't quite agree with that. This movie kind of picks up where we left off last time, and it tackles the consequences of everything that the characters do in the first movie. It questions what happens when you break the rules of fairy tales, and it interrogates a separate set of constraints compared to the first movie. So I don't think it's like a useless addition, just there to make us laugh. I do think it does certain interesting things with the characters in the story.
I agree. They really utilize the characters that were built in the first movie. Like everything that we establish and all the nuances. The first movie got us all on the same page about the nuances of these characters. And then now here it feels like they can finally say something more about, not that they didn't in the first one, but they took that even farther, you know?
Yeah. A comparison that comes to mind when we're talking about superfluous sequels is something like Disenchanted. I remember we discussed how Enchanted already talks about what happens after the happily ever after. And then in Disenchanted, they pretend like that's not what the movie had already done. And so they rehash the same thing again and do it worse. But here we get a very distinct storyline compared to the first movie. And it's a continuation, but also it adds a new perspective.
That's a good point. Like, I think my take had been like, if you're already, exploring happily ever after, you can't do it again. But actually, this is like a master class in doing it again. Because they kind of are doing happily ever after again, except you can see so clearly that you could if you just, tried writing decently. But so we will be discussing this movie chronologically, as always. And do you want to start us off?
So we begin, much like the first movie, with a storybook. This time narrated by Prince Charming, who talks us through his process of braving the elements to find Princess Fiona, and we see him go to her castle only to find out that she's already married. I love the callback to the opening scene of the original movie, but with its own twist. I think that's a great example of what we were just saying about having a new perspective on what could otherwise be a stale rehashing. Like I said, once again, we start with a fairy tale book, but unlike Shrek in the first movie, who dismissed the contents as bullshit, we see Prince Charming's figure flying off the page as if he's the ideal hero coming to life. And like the first movie, this one sets up certain expectations that are later subverted. Just like the monster became the hero, in this movie, we see the so-called heroes becoming the monsters.
That's a great parallel. I really like how we don't start off knowing that it's Prince Charming himself narrating. So when we get the slow motion hair flip, and then soon after it's revealed that he's the one narrating, like even just that 10-second span of time says so much about his character already.
Yes.
Such good writing.
Yeah, I was also gonna bring that up. There's something so interesting about the prince narrating his own story. It kind of feels like, similar to Princess Fiona, he's internalized the narrative of what's supposed to happen, and that's exemplified in what reads as him having memorized the contents of the storybook, because he's saying them out loud as he lives them.
You're right! But so he doesn't meet Princess Fiona, like you said, because Fiona has married Shrek and she's on her honeymoon, and it's so cute. Like the little video thing is, it's so sweet.
I love how we start off in this, well, it is a fairy tale in the very literal sense. And we start off with everything kind of being perfect. They're in this little gingerbread house and it's all great. But then slowly, as we see more and more of their honeymoon, more kind of violent and sinister elements start bleeding in, but that doesn't affect their enjoyment of the honeymoon at all. Again, it's like a mirror image to what we saw in the first movie, where Shrek was just leading this lonely life and he was very much affected by the villagers' perception of him as a monster. But now he's with Fiona and he's content, and so we just see them kind of running through a field of flowers and with pitchforks thrown at them, but they do not give a shit.
That's my favorite part of the little montage that's happening, because it really encapsulates the fact of their life. Like how being in love doesn't solve everything, all the prejudice, and the other way around too, how they can still fall in love even when they're seen as these monstrous beasts by the masses and having to deal with their prejudice. They still have this really sweet romance amongst all of that.
Yeah, and it just goes to show that they have their own happily ever after already, and even if it's not the conventional one that everyone accepts, that doesn't invalidate it.
Yeah, but they come home from their honeymoon to Donkey having set up shop in their home. and not taking the hint that they want some alone time because Donkey is having some marital problems with the dragon partner that he has. But yeah, so they kick Donkey out, but they can't really be alone because dun 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 dun.
Royal announcers show up
Yeah.
to invite Fiona and Shrek to the kingdom of far, far away for a royal ball in celebration of their wedding and for Fiona's parents, the king and queen, to give them their blessing. Shrek doesn't want to go.
Yeah.
I love how each character is preoccupied by a different part of the announcement. While Donkey is easily dazzled by the prospect of a royal ball, Fiona is stuck on the mom and dad part about the prospect of seeing her parents again, especially in her current form. And Shrek is hung up on the mention of Prince Charming, obviously nervous about the fact that he doesn't exactly fit that description.
I really love how, I mean, this goes back to the first Shrek, obviously, and I love the new context that we get here of, meeting the in-laws, like the whole class divide or maybe even like racism. Like, I love how they depict it in this movie. Because, like, Shrek's right. It's very understandable where Shrek is coming from, and his worries are warranted and stuff. So it makes for a very, like, satisfying watch, I guess, because no one's being stupid. Like, we understand why Fiona wants to go home. We understand why Shrek doesn't want to. We understand why they still go. It all makes sense.
Yeah. They set off in their little onion carriage towards the kingdom of far, far away, which is very far, far away.
Yes.
And I have to say, I really like how the story's elements assume the identity of the stock element. For example, the kingdom, far, far away, being called far, far away, or Prince Charming actually being called Prince Charming.
Right.
I think it's such a great use of the weight and pre-existing notions that these elements come with, because it lets the movie easily set up certain expectations and then play around with them.
That's such a great point. You're right. And it also, like, presents us with familiar concepts.
Yeah.
And I think that actually presents a really interesting concept of, like, this is why it's even more dangerous, I guess, to rely on your biases, I guess. But it makes that person even more dangerous, like, because you don't put up walls against it or whatever, the way you would with, like, a stranger.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so in this scene, they play around with the concept of the kingdom far, far away. And this is played out in this really long journey. And I like how it's kind of symbolic of Shrek's anxieties about going far, far away from his home. And it's also a stark contrast to the opening scene when Prince Charming was effortlessly zooming through all of these different landscapes while they have to painstakingly make their way through. And it potentially highlights how Shrek is not a natural fit in this world.
Yeah, because we go through this journey that shows, like, mountains of ice and whatever. It's like he's growing more and more out of place. And that is even more so the case when they actually arrive at the kingdom of far, far away. It's like this kind of, like, fancy cobblestone street kind of thing. It's, like, really clean too. I know it's like an animated movie, but even I was like, wow, that's a nice city. That's a nice European city.
Cleaner than a swamp, definitely. Yeah. But yeah, it's like the differences in their class, I guess, is highlighted via the physical distance.
Yeah, exactly. It's like a physical manifestation of, like, the ravine in their class divide.
Yeah. Donkey's being really annoying on this journey. And there's this part where Shrek says, "Could you not be yourself for 5 minutes?" And I think that's such great foreshadowing considering what's gonna happen.
Oh, you're right.
And I love the little bits and pieces sprinkled throughout the kingdom, like the brand names that they modify to fit the fairy tale setting, the nod to the Hollywood sign. It just says far, far away. There's also a billboard advertising the fairy godmother services. which I thought was so interesting. It relates back to what you were saying about preconceived notions and not letting your guard down around these archetypes, because this is basically the commercialization of magic that's supposed to be pure and wholesome. And I thought just showing a billboard of her first before we even meet the character is such a great way of combining the fairy tale and modern elements for the purposes of characterization.
Yeah, that's such a great point. Now that you mentioned the billboard, it really plays into the whole celebrity aspect as well, because we get to know like these fairy tale characters, including the fairy godmother, are like celebrities in this world. And again, that plays into the whole like building a false trust with the public kind of thread that we get throughout this movie with the celebrity aspect and with the, calling these characters by their archetype to mimic familiarity.
That's a really great point.
But yes, when they arrive, there are crowds greeting them, but also the king and queen. Their reception isn't great though.
Yeah, understatement. Everyone is shocked to see Fiona's state, the fact that she's an ogre and that she has married an ogre instead of the Prince Charming they were expecting. And we get this great sequence where Shrek and Fiona and the king and queen approach each other from opposite ends of the red carpet, and snippets of their conversation intertwine. And it's so clever.
Yeah. The parents are talking about being surprised that Shrek is an ogre and that Fiona is too. And Shrek and Fiona are arguing about how they shouldn't have come here and see people are reacting badly, blah, blah, blah. And I really love how this scene really highlights how a lot of this movie is about the interpersonal relationships within a marriage. The rest of the movie is obviously about that, but this scene was a really strong start in presenting this core issue and topic that the rest of the movie delves into.
Yeah, you're right.
And we get to see it with two very different marriages, newlyweds and a couple that have been together for a really long time, and all of these other differences between them as well, of course.
And a lot of the issues take place between these four characters and are dependent on their dynamic. And so this is an introduction to that, basically.
Yeah.
Just to backtrack very slightly, I really liked the inclusion of the onion carriage that brings them to the castle, because in the last movie, at the very end, we had seen them ride off to their happily ever after in the same carriage. But in this context, it becomes a whole other thing. It becomes this hideaway that's shielding them from the eyes of society. And we even see Donkey sitting at the back of the carriage, even though he loves to refer to himself as the steed. And that is the role that he plays in Shrek and Fiona's story. He just isn't able to fulfill that role in the conventional sense because he's perceived as inadequate.
Yeah, that's a great point. But like we said, the whole class divide / racism stuff is introduced even from the very beginning, from the invite. But here I really like how, it's true for the rest of the movie as well, but I really like how real the conversations they have are around it. Like when they're approaching each other and Shrek and Fiona are like arguing with each other, Shrek has this part where he makes a quip about how weird it is that Fiona's parents sent her off to live in a tower locked all alone. And it really feels like one of those things where like you find out a weird rich person thing that your partner grew up with or something. I don't know, like this whole movie has so many elements of like, visiting your partner's hometown kind of thing, and like finding like things that are unfamiliar to you. And it's obviously focused a lot around the class divide, but that little quip just really tickled me. And I love when stuff like that comes up throughout the rest of the movie.
Yeah, for all we know, rich people do lock up their kids in towers, so...
I think it's called boarding school, actually.
In a similar vein, Shrek mentioning the absurdity of Fiona's parents locking her up in a tower can also function as a sort of, not critique, but like as a maybe some kind of commentary on this very popular trope like a tongue-in-cheek sort of poking fun at this element of fairy tales that we all take for granted. And aside from doing that, it also serves the characterization because they point out how absurd it is, but then they also turn it into this belief Fiona has that they were doing it for her own good. So not only does it point out how weird it is, but it also informs Fiona's character and highlights the relationship that she has with her parents, where she continuously, despite evidence otherwise, believes that they're always acting in her best interests.
Yeah. But we get to know more about these relationships within this family at dinner. I really love how the whole thing plays out, basically how it's shot, how rapid the dialogue is. It feels a little bit like battle, which is often true of family affairs. It was just so nice to watch. And it's also like, you know, there are these fantastical characters and elements, but they're having a normal, shitty dinner with your in-laws kind of meal.
My notes just say a lot of class divide undertones, and that makes me laugh because it's not even undertones, it's overtones. It's tones. I mean, everything down to the way that the king immediately treats Donkey like he's an unruly pet and doesn't want to let him sit at the table, and the comments that he makes, and the way that Fiona tries to sugarcoat their situation, telling her parents that Shrek owns land and it's an enchanted forest until, you know, Donkey laughs it off.
Yeah. That's a good point. Now that you mention that, I am a little upset, I guess, that they don't really resolve the fact that Fiona does kind of... I know she's not actually embarrassed of Shrek and where he's from, but that never really comes up. Not even in the sense of Fiona saying, like, she's not actually embarrassed. She's trying to make the dinner, like, go more smoothly. She's literally just, like, clowning on her parents, you know? She's just lying. But it never really comes up because, like, that's such a big part of this issue now that I think about it.
To some extent, maybe that is already an understanding between them, because if that were an issue that she's potentially embarrassed or Shrek thinks that she is, I don't think they'd be there in the first place, you know?
Fair. I think the only resolution that comes to mind for me is when she tells her parents that she's going to find Shrek and go home to the swamp again. And that's a surprise to the parents, right? Because it's like, oh, Fiona actually likes the life that she's leading and blah, 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 blah.
Yeah, but yeah, the tension in this scene erupts when the queen mentions children and the king starts making snide comments, and all of it results in Fiona storming out of the room. And she goes to her childhood bedroom. I really like this scene. There's something about the feeling of visiting an old space as someone completely new that feels very universal. And we see so many hints in her room of the life that she dreamed of, the life that she was told that she was supposed to lead. She even has toys of a princess, a knight, a dragon, and an ogre, showing how large a presence this curse had on her life. And she looks at the princess toy briefly, and you can sense her feelings of loss for the person that she used to be, or maybe the person that she thought she would be, which again is a very human feeling, and it's something you can experience even when you are happy and satisfied with yourself and the life that you're leading. So once again, I think similar to things we've talked about already, the movie really grounds everything that happens in very universal emotions.
You're right.
And that gives it a lot of emotional weight. There was this one review I read that said that it's not as emotionally rounded as the first movie, which I didn't understand because I thought there's a lot of emotion in this movie, if not more, if not even more nuance.
Yeah, I think more. But Fiona goes out onto the balcony and meets a fairy godmother. Like you said, I love how they used the fairy godmother archetype, that they make her evil instead of the inherently good this character usually embodies. It's like playing around with the harmless old man archetype again, but with fairy godmothers, or like with harmless old ladies even.
Yeah. I especially like the visuals around her. Like, she's very sparkly. She appears out of these bubbles. And I especially like the latter because I feel like it maybe hints at the fragility of the happiness she promises, because we see quite soon that she's extorting the king. She's threatening to take back the happily ever after that she provided him if he doesn't do as she says. So it's like, rather than a benevolent favor that she's granting people, the wishes that she grants are precarious deals. They're basically excuses for her to then go on to get whatever she wants out of them, because she can easily take back what she's granted.
That is such a great read. I love that. To me, it just evoked the imagery of Cinderella.
There is that shot in the original animation of Cinderella's reflection in the bubbles while she's cleaning. So I could totally see that. That's such a great parallel. I love that.
But because it's the fairy godmother, another element they play around with is a musical number. I also love how the number kind of details these stereotypical ideals that a girl, quote unquote, should want, that stories that have fairy godmothers often center around. Obviously, that's a pretty skewed perception of them anyway, because of the historical context those kinds of stories are usually set in, but still makes for a fun layer to this number. It kind of reminds me of Honor to Us All in Mulan. But yeah, I really like that. It's almost taunting.
As well as that, the line that specifically caught my attention was, I know what every princess needs for her to live life happily. And it's kind of a summary of everything that Fiona goes through, because everyone is constantly shoving her into this princess archetype and its accompanying requirements. And so much like Shrek, if she doesn't meet these requirements, it's like she's not adequate. She's not a real princess. And in this way, I really like how Fiona and Shrek have parallel experiences, because for both of them, people look at them and assume they know what they need and that they need to be helped at all.
That they need to be fixed.
Yeah, exactly. But the musical number ends and Shrek barges in, and the fairy godmother is shocked that he is Fiona's husband. And before she leaves, she gives Fiona her business card that says, happiness is just a teardrop away. Similar to what I already said about how she seems to be using her wishes to extort people, this feels like kind of a sinister saying, because fairy godmother seems to be summoned when people are in a low place and might be especially vulnerable. And again, it's such a great twist on the benevolent figure who appears when you're most in need, because she's taking advantage of you.
Yeah. But when the fairy godmother leaves, Fiona and Shrek have a fight about how Shrek doesn't care what Fiona wants. At least, that's how Fiona feels. And she points out that she's made changes for him, so it feels like he should also compromise in return. It did occur to me that Fiona isn't exactly sensitive to what Shrek is dealing with, which is both insensitive and also, I feel like she should be, because she's lived as an ogre for a while now. It feels like more of a Shrek 1 Fiona trait.
That's the thing. She has lived her life as an ogre, but in very different circumstances, because she's been transforming in darkness and solitude, and she hasn't had to face that same kind of judgment. And that's kind of what I like about this movie, that in the first one we saw how much they had in common, and now it's interesting to see the differences in their experiences and worldviews now that they're together, because the way Shrek has been treated by humans all his life influences how he behaves as the typical ogre, but Fiona has also lived as a human, whereas Shrek hasn't. So these experiences inform their different approaches.
You're right. You're totally right. Again, I wish we had gone more into that. Because, I feel like so much of this movie is about, how differently they grew up, right? Shrek keeps discovering all of these things that Fiona grew up with that are kind of really fucked up. But we never really questioned that in Fiona as a person or as a character.
Yeah, I guess there isn't as much scope to explore Fiona's perspective. I think maybe there are parts of the movie that are very focused on physical comedy and things like that, and action scenes that potentially could have been traded out for a more detailed exploration of Fiona's perspective, her relationship with her parents, and especially what she says in this scene, the fact that she has made a huge change for Shrek because, like I said, she hasn't really experienced being an ogre the way Shrek has, but she's taken it in stride, like we saw in the opening sequence. So, yeah, I think it could have been an interesting parallel to Shrek's experience.
Yeah, having said all of that, though, I do really love the scene. Again, I love that this movie is about the conflicts within a marriage, how you have to repeatedly meet your partner in the middle and compromise. And especially now that you mentioned the parents and Fiona's relationship with them, that loving and knowing someone so intimately that you married them means being aware of their like idiosyncrasies and the flawed relationships they have with their own parents, and how your own relationship with your partner can be intertwined so much with that because you've chosen to make your life into a singular entity. So like Fiona's problems with her parents, like their weird relationship and all of the baggage that comes with it, isn't just Fiona's problem anymore, it's also Shrek's, and that's like inherent to a marriage.
Yeah.
And as we see at the end of the scene, knowing that sometimes you're the person making the person you love most cry, the way Shrek finds out through the door when Fiona is crying.
That is kind of heartbreaking. But that could be what Fiona is grappling with because they're also in this setting that's very conducive to exploring things that were in Fiona's past. And again, the weight of the expectations that have always been pushed upon her. And so we could have seen her basically grappling with those same expectations that Shrek is, but encompassed in her relationship with her parents and interrogating all of the complications, I guess.
Yeah. We also see this conflict, this issue present with the parents as well.
Much like Fiona and Shrek's discussion, except slightly calmer. They're talking about everything that's happened, and the queen seems to be a lot more chill about it, whereas the king is freaking out.
I love what we find out about this marriage as well, and especially within the context of parenthood and parenting an adult, which is in this scene presented as making up for the mistakes you made in the past, painfully aware that they can choose to not forgive you and you can lose them, as the queen puts it. And I really love that we see this marriage is filled with these discussions between you and your spouse and these arguments about decisions around your adult daughter in order to present yourself as a singular unit and not cross that line of, you know, not being forgiven and maintain a positive relationship, because with them being married, whatever one person does will affect the other's relationship with their child, and how like the good and bad of that, right? Like you're always on the same team, but you're also always on the same team when you'd rather not be. If the king fucks things up with Fiona, the queen also loses her. And within their marriage, they're having to constantly negotiate and argue about the decisions that they're making together because it will affect both of them. And I love how that's kind of not even the other side of the coin to Fiona and Shrek's issues, but just like a different version of the issues present in Fiona and Shrek's marriage as well, or in any marriage, I guess.
They do serve as an interesting parallel to Shrek and Fiona's marriage. So, in the middle of their conversation, the fairy godmother pops up and wants to talk to the king, and she forces him into her carriage and they ride off and talk about a deal that he's made with the fairy godmother to get Fiona to marry her son, who turns out to be Prince Charming.
Dun dun dun. I was surprised and delighted by the presentation of the fairy godmother as this like mob boss kind of figure. I also love that here we see that Prince Charming is just like a pouty mama's boy, and he gets like the child's meal at the drive-thru.
A little paper crown to match his little aspirations of being king.
Yeah.
When he tries to confront the king about how he braved the elements to find Princess Fiona, his mom tells him to shut up and seizes the narrative from him. And even though she says the same things, you can tell that she's the one in control. She's the one pulling the strings behind the scenes.
Very stage mom of her.
Yeah.
But this is when we find out that she is strong-arming the king into making sure that Fiona gets together with the prince. And the king goes to a tavern to try to find a mercenary to get Shrek taken care of. The mercenary that he approaches is Puss in Boots.
Yeah, hidden in the shadows for now. We don't get to see him until later on.
You're right, it's Puss in Shadows. My bad.
Yeah. I mean, I was wondering if he hides like that to prevent misconceptions about his abilities, because he's too cute to be an assassin.
You're right.
But later that night, Shrek has a troubled night's sleep with reminders of the life Fiona would, or apparently should have had, everywhere in the room. And unable to sleep, he explores the room and finds her old diary. And I really love the setting. I love that they're staying in her childhood bedroom because it feels like a great place for Shrek to confront the reality of their situation, to second guess their relationship in light of everything Fiona seemingly wanted when she was younger, under the weight of various expectations.
Yeah, and it really paints a picture of how she grew up, what she grew up with, what kind of bullshit was like fed to her, right? Because there are these toys, like figurines, slaying an ogre, and then there's one that like has a voice box. And it actually says the line that's like, blah, 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 here's a token of my gratitude, the way Fiona offered Shrek when she was saved in the first movie. So, like, there's all of this proof of what made Fiona who she is. And, like, especially with that line specifically, he's like, oh, these are all kind of familiar things. Like, these are elements that I've seen in my wife, you know? It's not something separate from her. Like, even though she obviously, like, knows better now and stuff, and, like, things have changed, but, like, she still grew up with all of that. I think that's something a lot of people have to contend with when they're making connections with people who are different from them.
It also gives the impression that he has popped in and derailed her life, basically, taken it off of its expected course. In her diary, there are several pages where she's written Mrs. Fiona Charming, and all of it serves to solidify Shrek's feeling of inadequacy. Because before, at least it was coming from people that he's not close to. It's coming from society. It's coming from his in-laws. But I think this is what really hurts him, is when it seems to come from Fiona herself, even if it is a past version of herself. Because, like you said, even if she has changed her mind now, it is still a version of her, and it is still intertwined with the person that he met and fell in love with. Like the line that she was basically fed as a child, that she regurgitated. At the time, he didn't know it was regurgitated, and it's like a part of their story. And to find out that it was meant to be relayed in a completely different context to a completely different person might make it feel like it wasn't real all along. Like it wasn't for him. It retroactively puts everything in a different light almost.
Yeah. Throughout our discussion, I'm realizing more and more how much of it is about Shrek's feeling of inadequacy. But honestly, when I was watching it, I'm thinking that I'm in Shrek's head going, oh my god, she grew up with such awful things. Especially because we've known Shrek to be so unapologetically proud of who he is, and he likes himself and all of these things. I feel like the stuff that he's encountering are not only awful, but also unfamiliar to an extent. Like, he didn't grow up with any of this kind of shit, and, like, he knows of it in a vague kind of way, but seeing it all, like, as tangible proof and stuff that Fiona grew up with is really jarring and upsetting. But yeah, you're right. It fuels his inadequacy that, you know, is what the whole movie is about.
Yeah, he's only read about it in books.
But speaking of books, in Fiona's diary, we see these entries where she sounds like such a young child.
Yeah, it's written in crayon too.
Yeah. And when she gets sent off to get locked up in the tower, she's still a young child and she doesn't understand what's happening. She's like, my parents said that this is a good thing and I'll be saved and blah, 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 blah. It was just like horrifying. I was like, holy shit.
And even more so that she continues to have that perception of her parents. And I think that is the part that feels unexplored and not fleshed out completely. I think that's what is missing. From the beginning, from when she was a kid up until now, she believes that it was all in her best interest and that her parents could do nothing to harm her. But she never really comes to the realization that this was actually very harmful. This was actually a very awful thing that they did. And they never have any kind of, I mean, forget a confrontation. They never even have any kinds of doubts rise up in Fiona. So that feels like a bit of an oversight.
Yeah, and it's not like they establish that in this world that's just normal, because like maybe for someone of Fiona's like class or whatever, but like we see that Shrek is like, dude, that's fucked up, you know?
Yeah, even for rich people.
Yeah, but it's like this thing where like once you leave the environment that you were trapped in or that you grew up in, you can see things in a new light. And like with Fiona connecting with Shrek, maybe she learns that what happened to her wasn't okay. And I mean, now this is just me like reading into it because I want there to be stuff about this, but like you can see even here in her adulthood that the mere invitation from her parents is like this incredible thing. Like it shows how fucked up the relationship is.
Especially considering the fact that we see in the first movie that she's perfectly capable of getting herself out of that situation. She knows how to fight.
Yeah.
And so there was really no reason for her to be locked up like that, apart from the curse. And it's like she wasted years of her life for absolutely no reason. But yeah, while Shrek is reading Fiona's diary, the king shows up at their door to apologize and asks Shrek to join him for a hunt the next day.
Hunt, all right.
Yeah, Shrek just doesn't know that he's the prey.
Yeah.
Honestly, I think this whole interaction is so sad. Shrek tells the king, first of all, that they both acted like ogres. And I think that's so awful because acting like an ogre has just become synonymous with acting horribly, acting uncivilized. And this is this guy's identity. And secondly, the fact that the king invites Shrek for a hunt, like of all people to invite Shrek for a hunt, just goes to show how little he knows about Shrek, how little he cares. And I really liked Shrek's expression when the king invites him because it really looks like he's remembering every instance that he has been hunted down by men who look just like this guy in front of him. And I thought it was a subtle but effective way of showing the disconnect between the two of them. Cultural differences, am I right?
Yeah. Shrek does agree because the king says that it would mean the world to Fiona. I also really love this scene, like the visuals of it, because Shrek is like shirtless and he has his like chest hair out and everything, and the king is like dressed quite nicely, or I think it's like in a robe or something, but he's, you know, he's more dressed up, and like the imbalance there of both power and, you know, visually, but also I think I really like the element of
it's also the vulnerability of it.
That's, yeah, exactly.
But yeah, the next day Shrek and Donkey set out to meet the king for the hunt, and they run across Puss in Boots, who attacks them. But when Shrek spares his life, Puss in Boots lets it slip that he was paid by the king to kill Shrek.
Yeah, to take care of him. I guess Puss in Boots ultimately does take care of him. He just misunderstood the assignment.
That's how he deals with ogres. He just becomes friends with them.
Yeah. Yeah, I also think it's funny that Shrek automatically brings Donkey with him for his father and son bonding time with the king.
Yeah, good point. Maybe Shrek thought they were going to hunt Donkey.
Yeah, he's like, I am not going in the carriage to go all the way back to the swamp with him again.
The king put out a hit on Shrek. Shrek put out a hit on Donkey. But yeah, now that Shrek knows that the king didn't want to reconcile at all, he starts to question whether Fiona would be better off if he were a Prince Charming type. So he tries to summon the fairy godmother, who says she's unavailable, so they set off to see her with Puss in Boots. So when Shrek remembers fairy godmother's slogan about happiness being a teardrop away, he tries to make Donkey cry so that they can summon her. And I really liked that because it was them basically leveraging her just a teardrop away system by manufacturing the tears. Like they found a loophole in her system.
Yeah. Interesting. That's a great point. I didn't even think about it being a loophole. Like, I was more thinking of like, you have to actively put yourself through something awful to even get the chance at happiness. Like, how it kind of embodies this really fucked up system. Like, not just the system to call the fairy godmother, but like the bigger issue that's like present in fairy godmother stories.
That's a really great point.
Yeah, where people go to extreme measures that are often harmful and hurt themselves just at the chance for happiness. And that's how desperate people are.
That's heavy.
Well, for a less heavy scene.
The scene prior where Shrek is contemplating his identity, I guess, and he's looking into a stream as he thinks about everything, and it kind of reminded me of the scene in the first movie where Fiona was looking into her own reflection and she was talking about true love's form, and it's like a mirror image of that, where at that point she was questioning whether she is good enough to be loved, and now he is going through that same issue.
Yeah. But yes, Fiona is confused because she can't find Shrek anywhere, and all she sees is that Shrek had been reading her diary from when she was younger. So she's going around looking for him, and meanwhile, the king is being really weird. Because he's really nervous about the whole fairy godmother thing, and they have this argument where Fiona does stand up to her father here and, like, you know, defends Shrek and the life that they're leading and everything. And this is definitely true to life, where sometimes it's easier to do that, like, in private, but it would have been nice for her to do that in front of Shrek so that Shrek knows how she feels and that she's willing to stand up for him and for the life they're leading. But this isn't a criticism of the movie. It's just, it's really well done that they did that.
I agree. Because bringing Shrek to meet her parents could go far enough to show that she's not embarrassed of Shrek, but it could also be interpreted as her just really wanting to see her parents and putting that need above Shrek's. So yeah, I didn't necessarily get this overwhelming impression that Fiona feels the need to hide Shrek or any aspect of their life, but it would have been nicer to see her be more open about everything and defend Shrek while he's there.
That is the issue with Shrek and Fiona in this movie, because all Shrek wants is for Fiona to be happy, and he just has this misconception that that means he has to be Prince Charming. But if Fiona actually defended their life to her parents, which is like the big sticking point, right? That they are not accepted by her parents, who she seems to love a lot, regardless of the past, then that would fix it. And I'm not saying this a fault of the movie. Like, I really like that it makes sense that things played out the way that it did. But in this scene, the king says that he's thinking of what's best for her. But, like, knowing how the fairy godmother and the prince act, isn't he worried how they might treat his daughter if she's married to Prince Charming?
I feel like he's not even thinking that far. He's just so terrified of his current moment being snatched away that he's not thinking about Fiona's future.
Yeah, and it's like in this scene, I was like, okay, I didn't know yet what the king's secret is, right? Like what the fairy godmother did for him. So I'm like, okay, maybe she gave him like prosperity in the kingdom and power and blah, blah, blah. So I'm like, okay, he's just like a bad dude, right? Or like a selfish dude. But at the end, he like reiterates it again when he's a frog. Like, I'm so sorry to like everybody, but especially to Fiona. I just wanted what was best for you. And it's kind of like presented more like a misguided person, you know, where his actions that were harmful were fueled by prejudices and everything, but like he thought it was right because he was like whatever, racist or whatever, right?
Yeah.
But to me, I still have this question of like, if you truly believe that, like, aren't you worried about how these people might treat your daughter if she's married off to them? But I guess that's like the case for a lot of these like royal marriages or whatever. But like, I think in those cases and like historical contexts or whatever, it's because the danger that they're shielding these daughters from is like poverty, like not having a place to live because they're not able to find that elsewhere. And that's why they have to be married off to these people. And that's why it's from the whatever king's perspective or father's perspective, whatever, it's quote unquote for the best. But here, like, they don't actually present that as an issue. Like, he's not actually helping her through this deal.
Yeah. It's not for Fiona's benefit at all. It's for the king's benefit so that fairy godmother won't take away his happily ever after. And so, actually, the ending doesn't make sense when he says that he thought it was for the best, because he actively prioritizes himself over Fiona. And that's not the resolution that makes sense for this character. It should have been him realizing how awfully he acted and that he wasn't acting in her best interest. And that's what he should have apologized for.
Exactly. I wish they had just not had him say that at the end, because like it's fine that he says it here because he's lying, but I wish they just hadn't had him say that at the end.
I agree. So when Shrek and Co arrive at the fairy godmother's place, initially it looks like a cozy little cottage, but then you zoom out and it's a whole factory.
Yeah.
Once again, it's the commercialization or even the industrialization of something that's considered pure and benevolent. And the inside of the factory reinforces this even more because we see these faceless workers scuttling around, and there's this conveyor belt rolling out potions and potentially also animal testing. And it's all very sinister.
Yeah, it's the mass production of magic.
Yeah. And Shrek pretends to be from a workers' union to be let into the factory, which is like such a great joke.
It's great.
And yeah, once they manage to sneak in, they walk in on fairy godmother making potions, like some demented witch.
Yeah.
So she's got these ingredients, including this bottle of lust. And I love that it kind of looks like a bottle of bleach. I just love the mundanity of bleach compared to the ingredient, and especially the sinister context that it's being used in. It's like it's meant to clear away any real emotion and just replace it with pure lust.
Evil.
Very evil. Initially, Shrek is very straightforward, and he actually asks for her help in, making Fiona happy. But she's very dismissive of him and tells him that by his very nature, he can't make Fiona happy because there are no ogres and happily ever afters. She tells him he doesn't deserve one, basically.
She also takes Pretty Woman's name in vain.
Yeah, I thought you might bring that up.
I was really surprised that the fairy godmother just immediately dismisses Shrek and talks shit to his face. I expected her to be deceitful. She's like, oh, he's come to me. I can use this to my advantage. Like, lead him down a different path, give him a bad potion, whatever. But she's just so blinded by her racism that she won't even, have a discussion with him. Like, I was really surprised. I'm like, oh, okay, so she's just straight up, like...
Yep, she's a bigot.
Yeah.
If I had to pinpoint one part of the movie that justifies its existence, I think I would pinpoint this scene, because it's here that it really struck me how the movie is exploring what it means to break the fairy tale stereotypes that they did in the first movie. It's like the consequences of the actions that they carried out in the first movie. Now they have to face the music, because it's not just riding off into the sunset, that's the end. Stuff happens after that too. And it's basically asking the question of what happens. What are the consequences when you don't conform? So that's my answer to all the critics who think this movie is unnecessary and superfluous or whatever.
Your answer is much better. Mine is just marriage sucks. So the fairy godmother is clearly not going to help, so Shrek disguises himself in the worker's uniform, which is hilarious because it only fits his head. I'm just like, what are you doing?
He looks so out of place amongst all the other workers because they're all the same size. And I guess it's yet another point about conformity or whatever, but visually it's just very funny. And so after disguising themselves, they sneak off to the potion room, which is very conveniently labeled like this is Willy Wonka's factory or something. But Puss in Boots, finds one that's labeled happily ever after. I really like that this potion is on a shelf labeled restricted access, because access really is restricted for someone like Shrek, who doesn't fit into the archetype of the kind of person who deserves a happily ever after, like the fairy godmother has just told him.
That is an amazing catch. I love that. I love this whole scene. I love how they escape too. And there's the little, I mean, we haven't really talked a lot about the references, but here there's Puss in Boots like doing the circle cut thing like you do in spy movies.
Oh, yeah.
And also there's the Indiana Jones reference where he pulls his hat just in time for the thing to close. It's just so fun. So they manage to escape, and it's this whole like action sequence, and it's so fun. They're like running on the little conveyor belt, and then they're like smashing all of these potions, but they manage to escape. And the fairy godmother is telling everyone off for like the mess and everything, and Prince Charming shows up and throws a fit, and it's just hilarious because he really is just a child throwing a fit.
Mm-hmm.
But so Shrek and the gang have this potion now. They go back and forth on, whether they should drink it or whatever. And I do love that leading up to the drinking of the potion, Donkey reminds him of all the things he loves about being an ogre. And Shrek is willing to give all of that up for Fiona. Like, he's so sweet. Like, this whole time too, like throughout the whole movie, he keeps repeating, I just want Fiona to be happy. Like, that's this whole thing. It's like, yes, it is also fueled by like his feeling of inadequacy, but the whole him being transformed of it all is very much a consequence. Like, it just so happens that he believes that's what Fiona wants. Like, it could have been that she would have wanted, someone who looks like Donkey, and he would have turned himself into Donkey.
It's not even a fear of him being an inadequate husband or like an inadequate partner. It definitely feels like his fear of being inadequate in making Fiona happy.
Yeah. He's seeing that him being an ogre is causing this huge hurdle for Fiona, right? And connecting with her parents and connecting with her people, her hometown is now acting really weird. And obviously there are also like the other prejudices that they have to face. And he's seeing that it's going to be really hard for someone he loves. And like for himself, he can like deal with that. And he loves being an ogre. But like when presented with somebody he loves so much, he just wants Fiona to be happy. Like, it's so sweet. I love them.
While he's trying to figure out what exactly the potion does, there's this line where he reads out the potion bottle and he mentions that it says beauty divine. How bad can it be? And that says a lot about our society, I think, how we value things based on their appearance. And beauty is considered a marker of various things, including lack of danger or benevolence or whatever.
Yeah, that's a great point.
But yeah, they decide to risk it and drink the potion. Donkey has some as Shrek's loyal sidekick, and Shrek has the rest of it.
It doesn't seem like the potion takes. Donkey and Shrek just go la-di-da and go on their way. But we do get a little hint of what it could do because there's a little bit that gets on a mushroom, and the mushroom turns into a rose. And we actually find out quite soon that it does have an effect because Donkey and Shrek faint.
So while all this is happening, Fiona is at the castle and she tells her parents that she's gonna go find Shrek and then they're going back to the swamp. But before she can do that, she also collapses.
When she talks to her parents, she says that she wants to set things right, and we see that when she reveals that that means going to find Shrek and going back to their home instead of staying here in the kingdom, it startles her parents. That's not what he imagined would have happened as a result of all of his meddling and stuff. And I really liked that moment where they kind of realize that they don't really know what Fiona would or wouldn't do anymore, and that Fiona really does care about Shrek, that her care for him has not surpassed, but like has taken a more primary role than her place with her parents. I don't know, I really like the scene. Even admitting that she shouldn't have brought Shrek here, and not in the sense that like because she's embarrassed or whatever, but because her parents are being mean. And it's like this realization that Shrek had a point. he wasn't just being grumpy, like he was speaking from experience. And it's really sad too, the way she says this line, because it's like an acceptance of this really shitty thing.
I think this would have been a great moment for Fiona to come to the realization that, like you said, Shrek's fears weren't unfounded, and she has put Shrek in harm's way by bringing him to this kingdom, by bringing him before her parents. And then it also would have been simultaneously a moment where she realizes that they don't always act in her best interests. And so it could have been the point where she confronts them about everything had they explored the familial relationship a bit more. But yeah, she faints and they all wake up to find themselves transformed into beautiful people, I guess.
I hate Shrek's human form.
Really?
It freaked me out. I discovered through this movie that, so I have a weird thing with human characters being transformed into animals. Like, I watched Spirited Away when I was younger and it scarred me for life. It just freaks me out so much. And I didn't realize that it also goes the other way. But apparently it does. I was just like, no, this is, it freaked me out. I hated it. I hated it so much.
I'm surprised you like the Shrek movie so much, considering there's so much of back and forth between human and ogre.
You're right. It didn't freak me out when it was Fiona. I think it's because, like, Fiona almost felt like coming back to her, like, actual form, like her real self, you know? But, like, knowing that it's wrong, I think, is what it is, you know?
There's also that anxiety about people not recognizing him, like him losing his identity, which is what happens later in the movie. So, but yeah, Shrek and Fiona are humans, and Donkey has turned into a stallion. He tells Shrek that Shrek is still a foul ogre on the inside, and that kind of highlights the superficiality of these requirements that have been forced upon Shrek and Fiona. Because as long as you meet their expectations on the surface, it doesn't matter how you are on the inside. And when Shrek was looking at his reflection and wishing he could make Fiona happy and saying that he'd change if he could, that change doesn't happen when he turns into a human. It happens when he learns to compromise and put Fiona's wants and needs before his own. So that's the character development. That's the real character development.
Yeah, and I think it's so great that they specifically use a storyline about Fiona bringing a partner home, because the broader issue of living up to expectations is condensed to this very specific circumstance where it is very much true that there are certain expectations from parental figures when it comes to their child's partner. And that's a very common thing, whether it be, you know, their background or just something that you've imagined for them that has so much weight. And the fact that that is able to communicate this bigger issue within society that's not just about, you know, partners and marriage and whatever, is such a great way of discussing this, and just such great writing.
That's a really great point.
But clearly I am the only one freaked out by Shrek's human body, because there are all these women all over Shrek.
Well, they don't know he was an ogre.
Yeah, I guess. So they discover Shrek is hot, and they also discover that to keep Shrek hot, he needs to kiss his true love by midnight to make it permanent.
Yeah, so they set off for the castle immediately, and it's a stark contrast to the scene where they first entered Far, Far Away, because now Shrek is riding on his horse, i.e. donkey. And there's no reason for them to be hidden anymore. They're fulfilling the roles that society deems them capable of fulfilling now that they look nice.
We also immediately see the way people treat Shrek differently in this new body, and it's really uncomfortable.
For sure. Meanwhile, Fiona has also woken up and realized that she's human again. And so when Shrek arrives to the castle, they're searching for each other, but they keep missing each other. And I thought that was a great way of showing how they're not on the same page. Because initially, when the potion seems to not work, Shrek assumes it's because he and Fiona aren't meant to be. But even now that he's in a human form and supposedly a better fit for her, they're still missing each other and still not able to meet eye to eye, I guess.
That's so true. It's again, a physical manifestation of where they are in their relationship emotionally. And because they can't find each other, Shrek actually gets trapped in Fiona's room by the fairy godmother, and Fiona instead finds Prince Charming, who is pretending to be Shrek. And to Fiona's credit, she is immediately suspicious, and she stays suspicious, which is great. I love that.
She knows her husband, and she knows the person she fell in love with, and she knows that the man in front of her is not it. I suppose the queen doesn't know, but her dad and fairy godmother basically trying to gaslight her into believing that that really is Shrek, even though it's very obvious that it's not.
Truly.
Again, I really like the childhood bedroom as a setting, and especially Shrek being trapped in it, because it's like he's symbolically trapped by society's constraints and expectations. When he's looking on from the window while Fiona meets Charming, the design on the windows even form these little squares, capturing this scene as if it's in a movie, and it's this ideal fairy tale happily ever after that Shrek is being excluded from.
Yeah, that's so sad. This movie gives me so much anxiety over each of their isolation. Like with Shrek being excluded from this unattainable happily ever after and this unattainable acceptance of the family, just excluded from the family entirely. And this culture that he's not a part of and that he's being actively shunned by. And the isolation of Fiona's whole thing. Like she feels Shrek is not really on her side. Like they're not on the same team right now, and it's really sad. But she's also like isolated from her parents because they don't understand her and they're not trying with her. But also with this deception with Prince Charming, she is also isolated in her really weird experience of like, this man is not my husband, but he seemingly is. Like, that is horror story level. I just, it's so good and terrifying.
You're right. So fairy godmother convinces Shrek that he should let Fiona go because that's her best chance at happiness. And she tells him to, quote, stop living in a fairy tale because Fiona's a princess and he's an ogre. And I mean, I think it's especially cruel that she phrases it like this because technically Shrek's role in a fairy tale is to die so that he can facilitate the happy ending because the monster has to be slain. It's like those archetypes in Greek tragedies, you know, like from the beginning you're fated to this one action.
Yeah. So Shrek is wallowing at the tavern when the king arrives to see the fairy godmother in the back. And he wants to call things off, but the fairy godmother doesn't let him and instead gives him a love potion to feed Fiona and, you know, threatens the king's happily ever after if he doesn't do what she says. And Shrek and co actually overhears. So now he knows what's up.
They get found out by fairy godmother.
Yeah, they do. But then we cut to this coverage of the red carpet at the royal ball, and it's like a broadcast on like networks like E. And I love it. I love this whole sequence of them like flipping through the channels and seeing like the fairy tale equivalent of all of these shows. And Gingerbread Man, or as you may know him, Gingy, is watching this TV coverage. And they watch this show called Knights, which is like cops. And they happen to see Shrek getting arrested.
They even pepper spray Shrek, but it's actual pepper.
That's so funny.
It's not even like a pepper shaker. It's one of those ones that
it's
you
a
turn.
grinder.
It's like
But Gingy and
friends
go to rescue Shrek and friends from the dungeon or whatever.
It's so funny to me how quickly they seem to get there when it took Shrek and Fiona like half a month to arrive.
That's true. I didn't even think of that.
But yeah, they do bust them out. But in the meantime, Fiona doesn't want to go to the ball, but her dad makes her some tea and tries to persuade her, telling her that she should give this new Shrek a chance. And Fiona tells him that she would do anything to have the old Shrek back. And this seems to spur a change of heart in Fiona's dad because he had put the love potion in one of the cups of tea and at the last minute he switches it around.
Yeah. I love when Fiona says, it's the old one I fell in love with. That's also so sweet. I just love them together. But yes, I don't think we've actually mentioned what the love potion does, but Fiona is supposed to drink it, and then the first person she kisses, she'll fall in love with.
And I think it's the same potion that Fairy Godmother was maniacally preparing.
Yeah.
And if the amount of lust she put in there is anything to go by, this potion is strong.
Yeah. But so, because Shrek knows the nitty-gritty of this potion, that's why he's so desperate to go and save Fiona, because like Donkey or somebody was like, I thought you had given up, but all Shrek wants to do now is save Fiona, like regardless of, their marriage and whatever. So they bake a giant gingerbread man so that they can like quickly make it to the palace, I guess.
Yeah, and break through the defenses in the castle.
At the ball, Fiona is accompanied by Prince Charming, who is still pretending to be Shrek, and he's like so full of himself. And the fairy godmother pressures Fiona to dance with him by singing a musical number. And it's so good. She sings Holding Out for a Hero.
It's a great rendition.
It is. It's so good. Oh, and we get like bits of Fiona and Prince Charming dancing and Shrek fighting the guards as Holding Out for a Hero plays out, and it's so good. It's so fun too. Like, they do such a good job at this action sequence. Also, like, Fiona is dodging Prince Charming trying to kiss her the entire time. Okay, is it supposed to be ambiguous, like whether or not the king gave her the potion? Like, are we supposed to forget that it was the right cup? Because, like, there is this kind of tension that we're like, oh no, don't kiss him,
I don't know. It was never ambiguous to me. To me, it always read as him changing his mind. But, I mean, I can see it being the other way too. I can imagine the sense of suspense. I think it's more just like them trying to enact that plan, but failing.
You're right. It does just come from the clashing motivations of all of the characters present, And this tension is also broken because Shrek bursts in right before Prince Charming is just about to kiss Fiona. And they wrestle the magic wand away from the fairy godmother, and the fairy godmother tells Prince Charming to kiss Fiona, but it doesn't work because she didn't get the potion.
I really like how it's not just Shrek that Fairy Godmother is facing off against. It's also his cohort of magical creatures. It's like her against those she believes to be lesser than her. And it kind of reminds me of that scene from Barbie is the Princess and the Pauper when Preminger is brought to justice by those that he looked down on.
Oh, yeah!
But yeah, I mean, even if it hasn't been as obvious as her contempt for Shrek, I think there has been a thread about the fairy godmother looking down on other magical creatures as well. Like, the way she treats her workers is really awful. And so because of that, this scene feels particularly satisfying because even though they don't have her magic powers, they still manage to get her wand away from her. I mean, she gets it back anyway, and she tries to curse Shrek, but the king jumps in front of Shrek and the spell bounces off his armor and deflects right back to the fairy godmother.
Yeah, and she's dead, I think?
Yup. She turns into bubbles and disappears.
Oh, cute.
Mm-hmm. I mean, there's something poetic about that demise. In the end, she's embodying all those false promises that she's been making, and that's the end of her.
It is also the end of the king as we knew him, because he turns into a frog. And it turns out that the fairy godmother was the one who had turned him into a human. And he apologizes to everybody, and he seems accepting of like losing his wife and everything. But the queen tells him that she loves him just as he is. And so, happily ever after to the frog too, I guess.
I would just like to point out that his wife's name is Lily, and he's a frog. And they apparently met at a lily pond too, so I think they're a good match.
Aww. But midnight comes, and they have to decide if they want to stay human, because if Shrek kisses Fiona, they'll stay. And to my relief, Fiona chooses to be an ogre. And she says she wants a happily ever after with the ogre she married. They're back to being ogres, and all of my worries fade away. I mean, this is an element that I love from the first Shrek movie as well, but I love that Shrek actually likes being an ogre, and like we've already discussed, like his insecurity is not at all to do with that.
It's a great ending. Them choosing to return to their ogre forms, and especially choosing to kiss after midnight, shows them, but especially Fiona, going back to the life she chose rather than the life that she was expected to have.
Yeah, and it's also like because it's like a preordained like rule kind of thing, like she's going against that, you know?
Yeah.
So, an absurd conclusion. Puss in Boots misunderstood his assignment and he thought he was supposed to take care of Shrek and save his life.
Yeah. Watch out for him.
Yeah,
I mean, worked out well for both of them.
that it did. Well, now that we've discussed this movie in excruciating detail, have your opinions changed? Would you recommend this movie?
No, my opinion hasn't changed. I've always loved this movie, and in fact, considered it even better than the first one. I stick with that opinion. I think this movie has the freedom in some ways of already having set up the whole concept, like you mentioned earlier on in the first movie. So it definitely takes advantage of that previous knowledge and takes the opportunity to really explore some interesting themes and develop the characters and to tell us a different story while also making use of the characters and the themes it set up in the first movie. And it does so with some really, great humorous touches and some clever filmmaking. And all in all, I think it's such a great time while also exploring some really interesting ideas. So I definitely think there's more under the surface. You need to peel back all the layers. But yeah, this movie's like an onion. It's like Shrek. It's great. And I definitely recommend it.
5 onions.
Yes. 5 onions out of 5.
I completely agree. I think my opinion has changed actually because I did rewatch the movie for my notes. The first time I watched it, I liked it. I think I love it this time around because I was just less anxious about what was gonna happen with their marriage. So I knew what was gonna happen-ish. But yeah, this movie is so good and it's so fun. And I completely agree with you. I like it so much better than the first one. And I liked the first one. Not that this is a bad thing, but the first one was more about like accepting yourself and blah, 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 which is like nice.
It's no marriage problems.
Yeah. I think I just personally enjoy what they tackle in this movie way more. It's way more layered. It's got a really great cast of characters because we get the fairy godmother and Prince Charming and the parents and Puss in Boots. So it's much more engaging to me and it's really fun. I definitely recommend this movie. 5 onions. So that's all for our Shrek 2 episode. If you have any suggestions for movies we should discuss on the podcast, send them in at graveyard_slot on Instagram, the Graveyard Slot Podcast on Tumblr, or email us at thegraveyardslot@gmail.com.
If you enjoyed this episode, please rate and review. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you on the next episode of The Graveyard Slot.